What's happened to males in education then?
What's happened is that males have fallen rapidly behind females at every stage of the education system and in every advanced economy in the world. So if you just take all the OECD countries, which is a pretty good proxy for a decently economically advanced, there are more young women with a college degree than young men. In both the UK and the US, it's 60-40 now on college campuses. And that's happened incredibly quickly. When I was born in 1969, it was college campuses were about 70% male, 30% female. By the time I went to college in the late 80s, it was about 50-50, and now it's flipped to 60-40 the other way. And so on pretty much every measure you can look at, girls are ahead of boys, and that's increasingly true even in subjects like math and science. So one of the ideas people have in their head is like, oh, we always knew girls were better at English and women better at English and those sorts of subjects, but aren't boys much better at math and science? But the answer is not really anymore. In most places now, the girls and women have caught up in math and science as well, and in some cases overtaken, and still have this huge lead in literacy and English. And literacy and English turn out to be more important for what happens to you after that. So there's been this huge overtaking, which, by the way, no one predicted. It's really interesting. Go back and you read the stuff from the 70s when we were really pushing for gender equality in education to get more women into college and especially into more male-dominated subjects. And everybody was pushing towards parity. Nobody predicted that the lines would keep going. Nobody predicted that once girls and women caught up with boys and men, that they would keep going and that we would now have a bigger gender gap in higher education than we did 50 years ago, just the other way around. So we've flipped the inequality now, and it's actually wider now than it was when I was born, almost. And certainly in the US it's wider, and I think in the UK it's getting close. So that's an extraordinary fact that no one predicted and can only be the result of structural factors. If it's happening everywhere and every level, it's not the kid, right? It's not Chris's problem in secondary school in a particular education system, or my son's problem in the US K-12. It's a structural problem with the education system that's just not male friendly enough.
Structurally, what's changed then? Because just that more women are going to college and more women are performing better doesn't mean that men should be doing worse.
No, and it's important to distinguish, of course, as you imply there, between relative and absolute, right? So if one group is doing better than another, then by definition, the other group's doing relatively less well. It's like the gender pay gap, right? So the fact that women are earning a huge ton more than they were 50 years ago, but that doesn't mean they've caught up with men yet. So absolutely, wages have gone up. But in some cases, as the absolute educational performance of boys has flattened or has dropped. And so if you look at white working class boys in the UK, for example, or black boys in the US, actually in many areas, they're actually sliding backwards. But you're right to kind of point to the distinction between relative and absolute. What I think has happened is that the education system is just structured in favor of women and girls because it rewards certain kinds of behaviors at critical ages, in particular, turning your homework in, being planful, being organized, being committed, sticking on the task, being future-oriented at about the age of 16, which is when the gender gap in those skills is at its widest. And so what happens is that girls' brains just develop earlier than boys. It's just a biological fact. And in particular, in the prefrontal cortex, this bit of the brain that's the CEO of the brain, it is the bit that turns your homework in, that says it's the bit of your brain that stops you going to the party and makes you stay in studying chemistry, right? It's the bit of the brain that every parent waits to develop in their sons. Basically, parenting is like a 10-year process of being the substitute prefrontal cortex for your boy. Have you got kids? Have you got sons?
No, not yet.
All right. Well, trust me, that's what it is. You're basically just going to be their prefrontal cortex until when is it coming? When is it coming? And the answer is much later than in girls. And so it's no surprise that girls are doing better. The surprise is that they weren't doing better before. Why weren't they doing better before? Because of sexism. The truth is that girls were always at a structural advantage in education, but we couldn't see it because it was never expressed in things like college going, exam taking, and so on, because they were preparing for a life of being a wife and mother. As soon as we took the break from women, the structural advantage that women had was exposed. So in a sense, by apparently leveling the playing field in education, what we revealed was that the women are much better players. And they are, as a result, largely, in my view, of development. It's also true that we don't have enough male teachers, that the pedagogy is not male friendly, and so on too. There's a whole bunch of things going on. But taken as a whole, you look at the school system, it's impossible to come to any conclusion other than that this suits girls better than it does boys.
That's fascinating. The fact that this has always been lurking below the surface, this has always been the way that the population within schools has been performing, but because of lack of access, lack of encouragement, gendered discrimination that has restricted women from females from being able to reach their full potential in the education system, it's only when you've been able to open up those doors that the underlying disparity has been able to fully show itself. And I suppose that it's difficult because if that was the case previously, the assumption now is that the only reason there could be a disparity between boys and girls' performance is now due to some other type of restriction or sexism. It's by boys being told something restricted in some way. So using the previous model of what was the solution to the problem for women and now mapping that onto the issue that men are facing, or boys. So it seems like it's more deep-rooted than that. This isn't the sort of thing that is occurring in the culture. This is something which is occurring in biology from a very early age.
Yeah, it's happening in the system itself. That's a great distinction. So I think that the main problem that women and girls faced before was they just had brakes on. They just had barriers. It was like, didn't go to college. Like my dad went to college because, that was where he was going to hopefully earn more money and be able to raise a family. My mum was basically encouraged to leave high school at 17 and said, "Do you want to be a nurse?" And the idea that she would have gone to college just didn't happen. And so you don't have to go, and it's so quick, this change that's taken place. But you're exactly right, and it's hard, I think, for people to get their head around that because it's happened so quickly that the idea that it's tough to get people to get their head around the idea that boys could be at a structural disadvantage in the education system, which until incredibly recently seemed to be serving boys and men much better than girls and women, like literally in the blink of an eye. And then there's a mistake that's made along exactly the lines that you've just identified, which is that some people say, oh, there must be discrimination against boys in education then. And you get books like The War Against Boys, The War on Men, etc., which is that there is intentional discrimination against boys. And there's almost no evidence. There's no evidence of that. Like no one said to my boys when they're going through high school, oh, don't you worry about college, just find yourself a nice wife and settle down. No one was saying that. They were saying, for God's sake, turn your homework in so that you stand a chance of going to college, you idiot. So it isn't discrimination, but it is instead the mixture of the difference between the chronological age and developmental age of the average boy and girl, especially in adolescence, has been revealed by the women's movement. And also progressively teaching as a profession has become more and more female over time. And so there are fewer and fewer male teachers in schools, and that does seem to affect male performance for reasons that are complex and so on too. And there's been a bit of a shift away from styles of learning that seem a bit more boy-friendly and male-friendly, like vocational education, for example, which does seem to suit, on average, overlapping distributions, seem to suit males more than females. And so so there's been a series of trends in education that have, I think, exacerbated this underlying structural problem, which is a 16-year-old girl is older than a 16-year-old boy in terms of her developmental abilities.
Just how big is did I hear you say that it was 2% of kindergarten teachers in America are male? Some insanely small proportion.
Yeah, it's about 2%. Yeah, and it's not going up either. It's similar in the UK. These numbers actually do map pretty well across US and UK. 1 in 10 elementary school teachers or primary school teachers male. And one of my sons actually works in early years education, so I get this, a lot of this, through him, and he's one of the very few males, of course, working in that space. And so when you dig into numbers, it's about 2%, which is very low number. And to put it in perspective, as a share of the profession, there are twice as many, or even 3 times as many women flying US military planes as there are men teaching kindergarten and pre-K classes. So we have about three times it's about 7%. 7% of US military pilots now are women. Now, I'm happy to have a conversation about whether that's too low. What should that number be? And what's actually happening, of course, is that most of the air forces are doing this. They're redesigning the cockpits of planes so that they're not designed anymore around a presumed kind of male height, which will allow shorter men to be pilots too. But it also, most importantly, will allow more women. So they're actively recruiting. They're changing the design of fighter planes to get more women in. Great. What's happening to get more men into early education? Answer: nothing. And so there isn't even seen as a problem to be addressed, let alone one that we're proffering solutions for. And so it's one of the reasons I'm really emphasizing this point.
What's happening, people? If you enjoyed that, then press here for a selection of the best clips from the podcast over the last few weeks. And don't forget to subscribe. Peace.